Well, for the last several weeks in these early chapters of Romans, over and over it seems like there's been a consistent theme in our messages that God is a God who not only judges, but you and I are people who deserve God's judgment. And there is a question that arises where we would stop and we would ask, is God fair to judge? And is all of this, how do we make sense of God's judgment? We just dismissed several of the kids to Wired, but we still have like a few here. Did you ever have a question as a kid whether or not mom and dad's punishments were fair? So I remember, made eye contact with one of my own kids. I shouldn't have done that. So I'm the middle of three boys, and I distinctly remember, I don't know how old I was, when we were all young at this age, whatever age I was, we all shared one room upstairs, and if I remember right, Mom was gone for the evening. I'm not sure where she was, and we had done something, I don't know what, but it was one of those punishments where it's straight to bed, do not pass go, do not collect $200. The rest of your night is lights off in bed, just go, right? That kind of punishment. It wasn't winter, it was summer. How do you go to bed? I'm not saying the sun was shining through the window, but it was close, in that sense of like, for hours, we've got to keep ourselves in punishment in bed. And I don't remember what we did. I don't know why. I do remember the distinct feeling that me and my brothers were convinced it was unfair in the punishment, and we had not been guilty of whatever it was we were accused of. And so our determination was that we were not going to abide by the punishment. We were not going to bed early. And brilliant plan of brilliant plans, the way we were going to keep this from my dad in our upstairs bedroom was to put pillows on the floor, because if we walk across the floor on pillows, who could ever hear this below in our house that was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Like this, what parent could outfool the three brothers, that we could outfool the parent, and we just were having a grand time running from bed to bed, getting out of our punishment, because frankly, it wasn't a punishment that was fair to begin with. And all I remember, so the way the bedroom worked, there was this stairwell that came up, and it wasn't a private room. I don't know if you might call it, you wouldn't call it a loft. I don't know what you would call it, but when you walk up the stairs, you're looking through the railing right into the room where our bunk beds and beds were. And I just remember Dad quietly, his head coming above the stairs through the railing. He didn't have much to say to us other than that we were repeating the exact same punishment the next night. Still convinced it probably wasn't fair, but it took me a while to learn my lesson. So we've been going for several chapters that God's a God who judges, and you and I deserve the punishment. Is that fair? Could it be that there are objections that we could raise when we come to Romans, and if we're honestly going to look at what Paul is teaching, are there some objections that we could raise to say, wait a minute, this isn't right, this isn't fair? Paul is aware of some of these objections because remember, he's been sharing the gospel in town as he goes to new places, and he goes to the synagogue and he's preaching and he's hearing Jewish objections to the gospel that he is preaching. And he wants to just acknowledge now in letter form, okay, I'm aware of what you might say against what I've said, and let me answer some of your objections and just point you back to the truth. So let's take some time to tune into these 8 verses, and let's look at... I was very helped by John Stott's outline and the 4 objections that he points out. So that's what I have written for you in your outline. I modified them just a little bit. But we're going to look at the objections Paul was answering. And by the way, they are kind of Jewish objections. Some will more and less relate to some of us. So once we understand their objections that, again, may or may not relate to you, let's step back then and just apply this. And what are some lessons we can learn from the way Paul deals with their objections? Let's walk through the passage and see what's happening. Look at verse 1. Here's the first objection. Paul's aware that the first thing somebody might say is the gospel that he's preaching, it somewhat undermines or it undercuts God's covenant with the Jewish people. And Paul's aware that someone might say, well, then is there any advantage to being a Jew at all? And Paul doesn't want anyone to come away with the conclusion that he's undermining God's covenant in the Old Testament to the Jewish people. Look at verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew, or what value has circumcision? Remember what's happened in chapter 2. The argument thus far, Paul has said in chapter 1, everyone is a sinner and guilty of sin, deserving of judgment. And in chapter 2, Paul says, and Jewish people, you're no better than the pagan world, Jews. And don't think that your law is going to save you. In fact, even circumcision that makes you a part of God's covenant family in the Jewish people, that's not going to save you. That's the closing argument that he's just come off of in verse 2, is to realize that there's a circumcision of the heart that is far more necessary. And so Paul recognizes the natural question might be then, well, then is there any advantage to our Jewishness? Does circumcision have any value? And if you're following along and tracking in the argument, you expect Paul to say, there is no value. But that's not what he says. He says the exact opposite in verse 2. And he says, actually, in every way, the first and foremost thing is that the Jews have been entrusted with the oracles of God. Of course there's an advantage to being Jewish. Paul's not discounting God's promises. He's not saying that the old covenant was worthless. Of course there was an advantage. And the chief thing among it is that God entrusted his very words, his oracles, his promises of salvation to the Jewish people. Think of this. Of all of the languages and of all the people groups, that if God wanted to reveal himself in human history, he picked the Israelite people, and he picked the Hebrew language, and he said, here, I'm going to entrust you with my revelation, with my message. What a tremendous advantage that is. Let's stop here for just a second. Paul is not discounting that there was a real advantage to being an insider with the Jewish people. Some of this, of the last few weeks, has been a heavy warning. Last week in particular, I gave a very hard warning to what you might call insiders, people that have grown up in the church. And I want you to know that that comes with tremendous privilege, to grow up with Christian parents, to grow up in the church. It is not as if that is complete, that there's no advantage to that. It's a wonderful thing at an early age to be taught the scriptures. And you might just stop and ask yourself, if you are an insider, I'm going off of last week's message. If you missed that, you might want to listen to catch up on some of that language. You might want to ask yourself, if you're an insider who's grown up, have I squandered the privilege of being entrusted with God's promises? Being able to be taught from an early age the very things that God has taught to us. So Paul doesn't want them to come to the conclusion that there's no advantage to being a Jew. He's aware of that objection, and he's saying, wait a minute, the gospel I'm preaching doesn't negate or undermine the covenant and the promise that God already made to his people. And so he's going to show then another objection in verses 3 and 4. He's aware that some might listen to the gospel he's preaching and say, accuse, that this now opens the door to accusation that God does not keep his promises. Does the gospel that Paul's preaching accuse God of not keeping his promise? Because Paul is saying there's still an advantage to the Old Testament covenant Jewish relationship of the people. And Paul's aware that some would say, well, wait a minute, the Jews didn't follow all of those commands. There have been a lot of faithless Jewish people. What about the captivity? What about all the suffering that came through this? And you're telling me that God's promises are still intact. And so now what? Look at verse 3. Paul recognizes, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? It's a great way to put it that Paul recognizes the situation, and he's saying the faithlessness of some does not negate the faithfulness of God. And so just because the Jews abandoned, in large part, their part of the covenant and their obedience, God is still faithful. And that's not going to negate his faithfulness. And so Paul answers with this, he's going to use this phrase another time today and throughout the book, by no means. God forbid, in the strongest language possible. Like, not on your life, Paul is saying. Not in 1,000 years. Are you kidding me? God will still be faithful. And then he says this, what he's wanting them to catch and understand, and keep in mind in the argument of the book, God is faithful to his Jewish people. His promises will be kept. We'll get more detail on that in chapters 9, 10, and 11. In fact, several of the themes and objections that Paul is running through here in summary form in these 8 verses, they'll be traced out at longer length in chapters 9, 10, and 11. But God's promises are going to be kept. And in verse 4, notice there's this interesting way that he puts it. God forbid, let God be true, though everyone were a liar. What's he trying to say there? He's saying that even when other people, in their faithlessness, in their unfaith, when they're with falsehood, they stand in falsehood over and against God in all of his truth. And though everyone else lies, God is still true. Even if everyone in the world is a liar, God's promises will still be God's promises, and God's promises will be kept. And that's true not only of God's saving promises, verse 3. Here's the harsh, uncomfortable reality. That's also true of God's promises to judge. And look at the remainder of verse 4. In this quotation, where Paul picks up David's psalm in Psalm 51, verse 4. And I want you to see, here's the way it looks in Psalm 51. This is David's sin where he commits adultery with Bathsheba. It's his prayer of repentance. And he says, the whole verse says this, against you and you only have I sinned. David is crying out to God, realizing that his sin is against God. And I've done what is evil in your sight, so that you, God, may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. David realizes that when God judges, it will be righteous. It will be the right thing. And so Paul picks up on this quote, and he's using it in that same sense that when God judges, God will be shown to be righteous. Verse 3, God is righteous in salvation. Verse 4, God is righteous even in judgment. Friends, Christians, we have to be comfortable leaning into both aspects of God's righteousness, both his righteousness in salvation and his righteousness in judgment, as uncomfortable as it may be. We are quick to want to believe, well, surely if God saves, then he'll be faithful. And I understand why this is near and dear to our hearts. We have loved ones. We have those we are close to. And God, show your faithfulness in salvation. But we have to realize that God is righteous and just, even in his judgment. And Paul is pointing to this uncomfortable reality that, yes, there are many faithless Jews that have turned their back on God. God will be faithful to keep his promises. But those that receive judgment, God will be just in that judgment. And he's pointing it out to them so that they understand. Well, okay, that raises a third objection. Because if you're going to say that God is just when he judges, it's like, stop just a second, Paul says, and realize what you're saying. This begins to open a door to accusation that questions the fairness of the judge. If God's righteousness is seen when he judges sin, then how is it possible that we who are born into sin and in our depravity we're going to sin, if God gets glory from judging me, the sinner, how is that fair? If the only way we can find salvation is through God's grace, where he initiates salvation, where God God brings about the works of grace to produce salvation in our lives, and you're saying God gets glory from judging me, the sinner, and I'm hopelessly condemned to sin, Paul recognizes, wait a minute, that someone could look at this and they could say in verse 5, if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what do we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? And it's as if Paul, he realizes the seriousness of the accusation he's speaking, and almost from embarrassment has to put in parentheses this almost apology of, I'm giving a human argument. This is what someone could say, that God's unrighteous to judge us. And then he gives that same response. By no means, God forbid, not in 1,000 years, not on your life. God's not unrighteous to judge this way. And the reason he gives in verse 7, at the end of verse 6, for then how could God judge the world? So Paul just takes that objection and he takes it to the logical conclusion. And he's, okay, if you're going to say that God's not righteous for judging our sin and that he gets glory in the judgment, because the logical way this plays out, again, I have to give the apologetic, scared to talk this way from a pulpit. I'm talking from a human means. The way this plays out is, what kind of a God creates sinful beings and gives himself glory for judging them? I'm speaking in a human way. And that's the argument there. And so if you're going to say, okay, get rid of this, because what God would do that, then you're going to have to come to the conclusion that nobody gets judged. No one. Now that's unthinkable in Paul's day. In mine and your day, we're not quite comparing apples to apples 2,000 years later. We've got a lot of people that are comfortable today wanting to erase the category of sin, much less thinking about eternal punishment in hell. But in Paul's day, and to the Jews he's writing to, that option is not on the table, okay? These Jews would have thought, surely God is going to judge the pagan world. It was a foregone conclusion that for Paul, this is the nail in the coffin. You believe in a God that's going to judge one day, and on Judgment Day, the righteous will get glory and the sinners will get hell. You believe that, right? And if you're going to go down this road that because God gets glory from judgment, that's not righteous, then nobody gets judgment, and everyone gets off scot-free. Now again, the tables have turned a little bit for you and I in thinking about this. I already pointed this out once, that first, in our day, many are quick to want to believe in a God that judges no one. Many dispute even the very category of sin. Leon Morris pointed this out. Still, even for those, one of the places we can go in defense and one of the places we have to stop ourselves in our minds is that usually we have at least certain categories where we look at certain things, like take for instance the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler. Can't we objectively agree that if judgment is deserved, that's it? And so we ought to be able to recognize, okay, second, then, because of that, the question that we're really wrestling with is not whether or not God will judge, but who God will judge. And there's many people who look at it and say, well, surely not me. Surely I'm not deserving of judgment. Perhaps even for Christians and those who have grown up in largely religious and moral families, you might think, well, I mean, yeah, Adolf Hitler deserves judgment, but surely not me. And one of the things we have to stop and acknowledge, and a question you would ask yourself, have you acknowledged that not only are you guilty of sin, Paul's made that case, Romans 1 and 2, all the way through. Not only are you guilty of sin, but you and I are deserving of the judgment that results in sin. The Bible study that we're going to be going through together in the exchange seminar, I love the way that it focuses in the first week on God's holiness. That because he is holy, sin does not match his character. It deserves his righteous response. That you and I fall short of God's glory because of our sin. Anything that violates God's standards. The second lesson, if the first week is on God's holiness there, the second lesson is on God's justice, his judgment, that he must judge sin. And it's a beautiful thing when someone is able to look at the scriptures and realize, not only am I guilty of sin, God would be doing the right thing if he judged me, because he is a judge who is just. We don't want to grow cold or comfortable with that reality. And so Paul says, God forbid, may it never be. Of course God has to judge. Are you willing to say that no one gets judged, is Paul's point at the end of verse 6. So there's a fourth objection then in verse 7. And this last objection would be one that would accuse Paul in his teaching, in his gospel teaching, of minimizing sin. And that what Paul is emphasizing, that someone is not saved by their own human effort, but merely on God's grace, and that God is righteous and glorified by giving his grace to sinners, someone would stop and say, well, if God gets glory from me sinning, then why is it a problem if I sin? Doesn't it make sense that the more I sin, the more glory God gets? That's kind of what happens here in verse 7. And Paul says, but if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? By the way, verse 7 is a restatement of the argument of verse 5. It's just that verse 5 uses righteousness and unrighteousness, and verse 7, the illustrative paradigm is truth and lies. And Paul is saying, so when I'm unrighteous in my lies, if God gets glory in his truth by judging that sin, then why is God judging me as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? It seems like the more I sin, the more glory God gets. And Paul says, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, Paul's aware that some are accusing him of this kind of statement. Leon Morris says, wherever people have followed Paul in emphasizing that human merit has no part in bringing about our salvation, and that we are saved by grace alone, some have drawn the conclusion that it does not matter whether we sin or not. And Paul just looks at this and he says, no, this doesn't work. He says, I've been accused of this twisted accusation, and it's an accusation that well deserves the punishment it's going to receive. And he's going to explain this a little bit later on when we get to chapters 6 and 7. He'll come back around to this concept. So those are kind of the objections that Paul has to answer. And like I said, some of those may have entered your mind, and some of them may have that's not what I wrestle with. I understand Paul was uniquely answering Jewish objections from 2,000 years ago. So let's try to say, all right, how do we apply some of the lessons from these 8 verses? What does it teach us about our relationship with God? What does it teach us about the gospel? What does it teach us about how we share the gospel? How does it strengthen our faith? And I want to acknowledge that there may be some here this morning or listening to this that maybe you are wrestling with some of these objections about the just and the righteous character of God, and maybe your faith at times wavers. How does this passage and what Paul teaches us, how does what he illustrate encourage our faith so that we can think through this well? Here's some lessons for us to apply. Number 1, think about what this means that God is the just God, okay? Number 1, here's the first lesson. If God's judgment is real, be encouraged that God told us. Be encouraged that God was willing to tell us about his harsh judgment. This is quite an interesting concept to stop and to think about, because there are some that look at the Bible and they see God's justice and God's judgment, and they see God describe his righteous character, and they say, that seems like a harsh God. What kind of a God has to demonstrate his wrath not only on his own son, but on his people who rebel against him, and a God that includes a punishment in hell? There would be some that would look at that and just say, I don't want anything to do with a God like that. And one of the things that's missed in that kind of an argument is, wait a minute. If God is so unjust and so uncruel as to do that way, why did he take the time to tell us about himself and his righteous character? His wrath and his judgment on sin is not a vindictive evil. It's a part of his righteous character. And if he really is God, as we proclaim that he is, he did not owe us one of his words, much less entrusting all of his oracles to the Jewish people. He didn't have to tell us anything. And one of the age-old questions that we wrestle with when we think about God and his judgment, and we look at that and we see what God reveals about his character, and when we look at our loved ones and we say, are they going to die? Is God going to judge this person that is so close to me? And we look at it and we say, why do they have to die? Friends, that's not the right question. The right question is, why should anyone live? And to have a righteous God that was willing to reveal his character and tell us about himself, that ought to encourage us to say, wow, yes, my God is a judge with righteous high standards, but he cared enough to tell us. He cared enough to put his words into human flesh in the person of his Son and to send Jesus to this earth to live among us. He did not owe us that, but he did because he loves us. I love in verse 2, much in every way, to begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. A couple Bible translations translate that as the very words of God. And I want you to think about what this means. Friends, this book is not just a collection of human thoughts about God. They are God's very words. One author wrote it this way. I read this a couple weeks ago and was so encouraged by this. He said, the Bible is not just a collection of human words about God, but it is God's word in human language. Do you catch that? He owed us nothing. And he said, you know what would bring me glory? I love these people. I'm going to take the Hebrew language and the Israelite people, and I'm going to tell them about myself in a language they can understand, that you and I could grasp. How does that not just encourage us to say, okay, this is a good God, and he's so good that he's not going to hide his just, righteous, judging character, but he's actually going to tell us about it. So let that encourage you, number one. Here's a second lesson that we could take away from all of this. The gospel is reasonable. Or another way to say this is faith has its reasons. I brought this book, I'm not quoting from it for no other reason than I like the title. Faith has its reasons. It's one of the largest books on my bookshelf, and that ought to encourage you that there's a lot of reasons to the reasonableness of our Christian faith. And one of the things that the study of apologetics does, if you're not familiar with apologetics, it's a study of making defense of the faith, being able to give a reasonable answer to those about our faith. There's a lot of people who are not familiar with Christianity. Perhaps this is how you view it there. Perhaps others in the world would look at Christians and say, you're ignorant, you have faith, and that faith is nothing more than a blind leap in the dark, right? That you can't make sense of the facts and the science of the world and things that actually make logical sense, and so you've invented this story in the Bible, and faith just causes you to blind yourselves to reality and just go forward. I'm speaking in a human way. Make sense? And we ought to be encouraged that Paul recognizes there's objections to the faith, and there's actually reasons that support it and back it up. Now, your objections might be different than the ones Paul had to answer 2,000 years ago, but be encouraged that there are answers to our faith. It really is something that we ought to be able to study and say, this is reasonable, this is logical. Now, without God's salvific work of grace to open our eyes, to cause a new birth, we won't have the faith we need to be able to connect those dots, but it is something that often through the studying of it and the learning of its defense, God uses that to cause the new birth and to cause closed eyes to become open and hard hearts to become softened. And so we ought to be encouraged that the gospel truly is reasonable. And I want you to see that Paul was aware of it. He knew there were objections, and he wasn't just going to discount it, And he wasn't going to say, we don't ask those kinds of questions, you just need to believe. He was willing to say, I'm aware these objections are out there, and we can work through them. So, building on that, a third lesson might be this, that our evangelism must at times include apologetic responses to people's objections. Not only for our own faith, but in the culture that we're living to, they're not going to ask the same objections that these Jews did 2,000 years ago. And you and I are going to have to think through, how can we give a reasonable defense of the faith so that we can answer? What are the questions that people would object to today? And in the permissive, individualistic society that we live in today, there's nobody that you and I are going to go talk to that wonders whether or not circumcision is necessary for salvation. Nobody. Maybe, at least I haven't talked to them yet. I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure that exists, actually. Certainly it would for those who are still covenant-following Jews. You and I are a lot more likely to run. We live in an individualistic, pragmatic, anything-goes society, and you're going to tell me that God tells me who I can and can't sleep with? And that's the kind of God that you say I have to follow? Well, are we prepared to help them understand that this is not God telling us not to have fun in life? This is God showing us the best way He's designed for us to live that leads to human flourishing. And we're going to have to be able to help people understand, okay, this faith, not only does it make sense, but it's defensible and it has reasons. And we're going to have to be intellectually honest. I don't want young people who are growing up under the families and the parents of Shawnee Baptist Church to think that there's a whole category of questions that are just like, we don't ask that. There's no good answer to that. We've got to be intellectually honest about some of the hard aspects that fly in the face of today's culture in the year 2026 in Chemung. Do you have answers for some of the Old Testament annihilation passages where God, as a demonstration of His judgment against the sinful people who possessed the land, gave His people the command to go in and clear out the land, killing every man, woman, child, animal? That's not easy to answer, but it does have an answer. And parents, you do not want your children growing up in a Christian home where the first time they get posed with that question is through an unbelieving professor at university. We've got to be people who are thinking through these matters of the faith. What about the reality of miracles and the resurrection? You don't want a college professor telling your kid that everything you tried to instill into them is a made-up hoax. Now, God's faith is what is going to have to ground their hearts and keep it, and if they're truly converted, they will not be lost. But you want to give their faith rooted grounding so that it can grow in the soil of the truth of everything that God has taught us and everything that we know to be true. And so we need to be people who are digging into these things ourselves, and if you don't know the answers, leaning on those who do know them, seeking to establish that truth in your family. We know that God's faith, that the faith is reasonable. It makes sense. It withstands the test. And we must be willing to defend it in our own lives and pass these truths on to our children. So one of the last words of encouragement that I would give is perhaps there are some in this room where I'm somewhat speaking evangelistically to those who might have doubts, to those who are passing on the faith. I've also been speaking to parents who are trying to pass on their faith. But for now, for a second, I want to talk to those who are professing Christians and acknowledge that a couple of the truths that Paul brought up, a couple of the objections that Paul brought up, and the truths that he answered them with, they may very well be things that you yourself at times have doubted with or may struggle with in the future. You're a professing Christian and you desire to keep the faith, but sometimes God's judgment bothers you, and how could God be righteous and just? Especially some of these questions about if we're saying that God is a God who gets glory from judging sinful people that he created, and he has the power to save them but doesn't, that's a hard question, and it will cause even Christians to stumble. Some of the things that Paul brings up in these 8 verses, if you're not aware, and part of the reason I wanted to explain them to you in the way that they would have understood them 2,000 years ago, there's nothing new under the sun. Many of them are coming back around, and I've spoken with people that have deconverted. They once claimed to be a Christian, and they no longer claim to follow Christ, and they've used phrases that are very nearly exactly what Paul brings up here. And so I just want to acknowledge that the doubt is real, and I don't want you, if you're a part of Shawnee Baptist Church, I don't want you to think that you don't have answers for these things, or that you have to hide, or that you can't bring these doubts into the light and seek conversation. So if you're doubting in these things, here's my plea. Please lean into the church community to find answers for these questions. If you're a part of this church community, Shawnee Baptist Church, please lean into this church community looking for those answers to your doubts. If you have another church that you're a part of and you just happen to be visiting today and these doubts arise in your mind, please lean into that community. It is so sad to me when professing Christians have these doubts, they don't feel like they can voice them, and they leave the safety of the church community, whether truly physically leaving or metaphorically leaving the safety of the church community, and they go looking for answers elsewhere, right? So parents, if you've gotten your kids to Christian university, do not think that the job is finished, okay? It may not be a secular professor twisting their minds. It could easily be former believer 5210 in a former Christian chat room online. Right? So many Christians' faith is being destroyed. Professing Christians' faith is being destroyed, I should say, because answers are not readily available in the church, and they quickly look online, and they're finding other people who have the same objections, and the truth is twisted and distorted. Don't go that way. Paul, who was he writing to? He wasn't writing to the Unbelievers Anonymous. He was writing to the church. And there were Christians at Rome that Paul knew needed answers to some of these objections. And he said, hey, churches in Rome, we're going to talk about this stuff. And so I just want to plead with you, lean into the church community if you're having some of these doubts. And by the way, this could go all ends of the spectrum, right? There's some that you would call Shawnee Baptist Church, but you're here and you're on the fringes. You don't have friendships here. You're not in deep relationship. You don't know enough names and phone numbers to talk to. If you have doubts, that's a problem. Lean in. And it goes all the way, just because you're committed. Some of you are here every Sunday, and you're a leader in the church. And this is true for me as a pastor. Just because we're fully committed, it is still just as easy to avoid honest, real relationships. And we might have these doubts and say, oh, I can't be vulnerable. I have an image to upkeep. I'm a leader. I don't know the answer to that question. Hopefully someone else will speak about it. Friends, we've got to lean into this community of the real flesh and blood relationships that God has given us, because our faith is defensible, and there are reasons for it. And particularly young people, if you're questioning, searching for some of these things, we want to help. We understand you may go look elsewhere for the answers, but please lean in here to see what the truth that we teach, include that in your search for the truth, and we want to help you in the way that Paul wrote to the believers here, and he says, hey, this gospel that I'm telling you about, God is righteous both in his salvation and in his judging. And we recognize that some have objections to that, and Paul says, bring the objections on. This faith will be withheld. By the way, even as I say we defend the truth, remember, the truth of the gospel does not need defense. God will defend it on his own. It can be defended. That's the glorious truth. and we want to help people see that truth. Let me close in prayer. I pray that there's some encouragement for you even as we go through this. Next week, we're bringing conclusion and wrap up to this section where Paul has been talking about our sin and the deserving judgment that we have. Lord willing, Pastor Jim will be walking us through this remainder of the conclusion section where Paul kind of summarizes and wraps up all of us in our sin. And then we'll finally see a turn. In verse 21 through 26, we'll see the righteousness of God that comes through faith. There will be some of the hope and the other part of the gospel that we've been waiting for that will encourage our hearts. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, would you encourage us with the truth of your gospel? Lord, we thank you that you loved us so much that you were willing to tell us about yourself and to put it in words that we could understand, to entrust your people with your very oracles. We rejoice in that. And Lord, I pray that there may be some here this morning who are wrestling with their own faith and their need of salvation, questioning whether or not you are righteous and good. And I pray that they would be able to find the truth. Even as Paul showed the answers for the reasonableness of the faith that he was preaching, I pray that we as your people would be consistent to teach that to others and to encourage them. We ask and pray in Christ's name, amen.